found the FarrCast, the weekly podcast in its sixth season of helping you understand what's going on in Wall Street, Washington, and the world. Now here's your host, Michael Farr.
Welcome to the FarrCast. I am Michael Farr. Thanks so much for joining us again this week. It is the 24th day of August. 24th day of August. Summer's over, folks. Can you believe it? Kids are going back to school. I am going to put a new sign on milk cartons for the month of June and July. I don't know what the hell happened to them. I certainly missed them. I'm looking for them. I missed June and July, and here we go. I think this is an age thing, folks. Sorry. Those of you my age, I can see you nodding right through the speakers. I see you nodding. Yeah, it just happens really, really quickly. And I know we're going to look up and it's going to be Thanksgiving and we're going to be talking about year-end things here on the FarrCast. And that's just the way the world goes. On the FarrCast, we cover Wall Street, Washington, and the world. And there's a lot going on in all of those places, right? The Fed is meeting out in Jackson Hole, their big unofficial conference. We're waiting for word from Jay Powell, and Wall Street's narrative's got it going again. We're going to have a pause. He's going to pause. He's going to talk about a pause. Don't hold your breath and quit trying to script Jay Powell. I've been saying it for 2 years. Wall Street just doesn't listen. Well, probably not going to listen this time, but he's going to say something Wall Street's not going to like. That's Farr's bet. We had Prigozhin, no more. A plane mysteriously went down with Prigozhin in it. And there we go. So Prigozhin is gone. That took longer than I thought it would, frankly, ladies and gentlemen. Who didn't know you don't mess with Vladimir Putin? Not a big shock. This is a bit shocking, though, over in Russia. There's no dissent that's going to be allowed, and things are more tense. Bad feelings in Russia, bad feelings among the troops, difficulties in Ukraine, difficulties in China. But why are you wasting time talking about all these things that don't matter, Farr? Because the only thing that matters is NVIDIA. 20 years ago or so, when I was guest hosting Squawk Box a couple of days a month and sitting there with my friends Mark Haynes and David Faber and Joe Kernan, they would sit off to the side. Do you remember, ladies and gentlemen? Kernan and Faber would sit off to the side. Faber was the brain, remember? And Mark Haynes would host on the desk by himself with a guest host. And that was I on several occasions, lots of occasions for years. And they made up a soundbite that would come over the speakers whenever we would mention one stock's name at that point. Qualcomm. Qualcomm was the stock that sucked all the oxygen out of the room, and I think we need a new one. NVIDIA. That's it, folks. We've got 7 stocks that have driven, that are up 85% year to date, and the rest of the S&P isn't up. So the rest of the S&P is looking up 6, 7%, 8%. Not a bad year, unless you happen to own those things that's just going wild. What do you do when you see this kind of concentration in a 500 stock index? Because now if you have Microsoft and Google in your portfolio, that's 20% of the S&P 500. 2 stocks. That doesn't count in for all of the other 7. So, and if you go to buy it, you're going to own a really concentrated portfolio. And if you own less than 20%, you're making a bet against those companies. So what do you do as a patient, disciplined investor who didn't get into these things that are on fire? And are you waiting for things to come back to earth? And as a portfolio manager, will you still be in business if you don't own them, waiting for them to come back to earth? That's what we're going to ask my great friend Jim Lebenthal from Cerity Partners and CNBC contributor. Good morning, Jim.
Michael, I was wondering how you were going to intro that NVIDIA piece, amongst other things, but particularly NVIDIA. Well done.
Oh, thank you.
In particular, because you ask questions that I think there's pretty clear answers for.
Good.
I'm gonna launch into it. I mean, what do you do? What do you do?
So, Jim Lebenthal, let's talk a little bit generically, because we don't want to actually talk about a specific stock. But let's what do you do when you see a stock or 2 stocks in an index, or 3 stocks or 7 stocks really take off, concentrated, drive the whole performance of the index. Happened years ago with Qualcomm. What do you do if you say, I don't own this, it's going crazy, it's going, maybe even think it's going too crazy? What do you do as a portfolio manager and investor when you see this sort of divergence of performance?
Yeah, Michael, really good questions. I think there's direct answers here. As you pointed out, there is historical precedent for this, right? When, I think about the late 90s. You mentioned Qualcomm, but I can certainly refer, as can you, to many of the Internet 1.0 darlings that went through the roof. And, many of them didn't have earnings. Some of them didn't even have revenue. And you're left scratching your head like, what do you do? If you're a fundamental investor and you're looking at these companies, they don't make sense to you, but they're carrying the market. What do you do? I think the answer, you gave a clue to it in your intro when you said, you're really short these names if you're not at the market weight. It's hard to be at the market weight of what are being called the Magnificent Seven because it's such a tremendous weight. And I personally am not at the market weight. But in the current environment where these things are, running away from the field, so to speak, I do think I need to add to them. I think that, you have to be careful about living in the world that you want to live in versus living in the real world. And in the real world, whereas these stocks may be fundamentally hard to get your arms around, they are carrying the market. They show no signs of abating. And I think you've got to respect that.
Jim, I think I agree with you. You make perfect sense, and I'm not doing it. I just can't pay that much of a multiple for certain stocks that get wildly expensive. If they don't fit my discipline and I see them running, I'm in this catch-22, because when I look at them and say, if that thing turns, if the bottom falls out, and whether I see that happening or not, I always have the fundamentals and a balance sheet to go to and say, look, here's why I thought this was okay, and no matter what, I thought you'd be okay. And I guess for my clients, I always want to be in that position of being able to say, no matter what, I thought you'd be okay. That's not to mean I'm right all the time. Sometimes stocks go down and you think they were going to be okay, and there's something that comes out of nowhere and something can go down. But I'm jealous. I wish I had the damn thing in my portfolio so I could at least point to it and say, see, I've got some too, but I can't yet.
Well, I think this is a question of degree, not a digital shall we or shan't we. What you just said, I completely agree with. And I can think of an auto manufacturer that trades at 60 times earnings, and people say, why don't you own it? And the answer is because I could buy it at 60 times earnings. It could go down to 40 times earnings tomorrow. Nothing else changing. You're down a third as my client. And I would have to say, I didn't really like it at 60 times. So why did I buy it? Now, I use that as an example, but I think really what you're supposed to do here is just take this in degrees. These Magnificent Seven, as they're called, they don't all have the same multiple, by the way. So some of them are more easily digested than others. But I think it's a degree to which you want to be underweight, at weight, or overweight these names. I certainly wouldn't be overweight. I'm not at the market weight. I think for me, it's a question of how underweight do I want to be? And with what's going on with these names in the market right now, just from I'm going to say it, from a business point of view, a career point of view, a client relationship point of view, I want to be a little less underweight. So it's a question of degree. And I think that's as clear as I can be.
I think you're being very clear. I think that you're speaking for a huge cohort of professional money managers across this country too. Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to see, if you own mutual funds and other things, you're going to see these names crop up in those portfolios coming into quarter end here, at least by the end of the third quarter. I promise they're going to be in there that weren't in there at the end of the second quarter for precisely the reasons that Jim has enumerated and said, look, it's a force that has to be reckoned with at this point, and I'm being judged relative to an index that's leaving me. The train's leaving the station. I think that's really important. Let me go to the Fed for a second. We've got Dr. Jeffrey Lacker, former president of the Richmond Federal Reserve and professor at several universities, coming up in segment 3 today, Jim. And I want to tell Dr. Lacker, I'm going to say, look, Jeff, one of two things is absolutely true, in my opinion, about the Fed. One is either they haven't raised rates enough to curtail inflation, or they haven't given their current rate hikes enough time to see how fully they will curtail inflation. And I'd like him to tell me why it doesn't make sense for them to wait a little bit longer, but because he tells me they haven't raised rates enough. What do you think about that? And what do you think we might hear from the Fed? And is the Fed becoming less consequential as we come to the end of this cycle?
I think there's three things I want to cover here, and I'll cover them briefly. I think the lagged effect of the Fed's rate hikes is more pronounced in this rate hiking cycle than in previous ones, because so many people refinanced their mortgages at ultra low rates 3 years ago. So many people bought new cars at ridiculously low interest rates 3 years ago. And it takes time for new mortgages to take over and the prevailing interest rate on mortgages to rise. Same with auto loans. New autos need to be purchased at these now higher rates. Not true for credit cards, but the larger point remains. The lagged effect, I think, is longer, which means the Fed maybe hasn't seen what they want to see just yet. The second thing regarding what Jay Powell says on Friday, like you, I have no idea. It's not a parlor game I'm very interested in. He probably maintains his overall hawkish tone, maybe throws the market a bone and says, yes, we've seen some progress on inflation, but we're not done, right? On the last thing I want to say is probably the most important. Inflation is the key here. Inflation remains the key.
Yes.
You've got positive real interest rates across the yield curve. That's good. That's where you want to be.
Yes.
How positive do they need to be? Does the Fed need to raise rates more, or can they let inflation come down and do the raising of positive rates, the raising of real interest rates for them? I think they can sit and let inflation come down. I'm not 100% convinced of this. We're predicting the future. But if you look at shelter and how lagging it is, and how big a component it is of CPI. Granted, it's not the only one, but it's going to have a meaningful downward effect on CPI in coming months. I'll grant you, certainly people are yelling right now, what about oil? What about gasoline? Yes, there's counter trends as well. But I think the biggest thing here is what's going on with shelter. It's lagging, it's coming down fast, and I think it's going to do the Fed's work for it in terms of inflation. Wanted to get those three things out quickly. I am done.
Jim Lebenthal is a partner at Cerity Partners, a contributor for CNBC on the Halftime Report all the time. My great friend, listen to Lebenthal. Thank you, Jim, for being with us.
Great to be on with you, Michael. I learn always when I speak to you. Thank you.
I learn as well. Coming up, Dan Mahaffee going to explain those debates. What happened to Prigozhin? Oh, my goodness. Aren't you shocked? No, I'm not shocked. We'll find out if Mahafee's shocked when we come back on the FarrCast. Please stay with us. And there we go. So what the hell did you just do, Harry?
Thank you for joining us this week on the FarrCast. Now it's time for political analyst Dan Mahaffee and your host, Michael Farr.
Welcome back. Joining me now, Dan Mahaffee, as he does every week now for 6 years. We're coming up on season 7 of the FarrCast, ladies and gentlemen. Absolutely amazing, but we're going to do it. Dan Mahaffee is the Director of Policy for the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, a Washington think tank founded by my friend David Abshire. God rest his soul. What a wonderful American, brilliant man. And he's also the senior political analyst on the FarrCast. Very, very prestigious title that Dan has there. Dan, welcome this morning.
Thank you as always. Good morning, Michael.
We had Republican debates last night. Lebenthal and I were talking about how NVIDIA is taking the oxygen out of Wall Street's room. Donald Trump left no oxygen on a full stage of Republicans last night, and he wasn't even there. And there was no oxygen in the room. And then we have General Prigozhin, das vidanya. See you later.
We know you have a choice of airlines, and you've chosen poorly with Prigozhin Airlines.
I shouldn't be laughing about this, but when that news came over, I was like, oh, because you're just wondering how long it's going to take, and now you go,
sure. Oh. It was almost like there was a countdown clock. I think just quickly go with that. It was it's the classic. If you're going to come at the king, you better have a plan and you better not miss.
And you better not miss. And he missed.
Right. And that's the price you pay. And be it, look, there's plenty of other, the original general of the Ukraine campaign has just died finally after a long and mysterious illness as well. We've counted all the various business people and officials who have fallen off balconies under mysterious circumstances in Russia, and inevitably, probably
construction. The balcony construction. A lot of those guys, or it's a balance issue over in Russia. A lot of those guys fall off of balconies, and open windows. They fall out of open windows. It's shocking.
And in the mind of Putin, perhaps a private jet is just a very high balcony.
Well, clearly this one was. And though we haven't, I don't know, does that just go away and nobody cares and goes, oh, well, I mean,
I think, look, we have to see, what does the Wagner group do? Does this, look, it's shown that Putin's back in charge in some ways, but there's a lot of angry people. It still doesn't change anything about what's going on in the battlefield in Ukraine, where you're actually seeing perhaps some breakthroughs in areas by the Ukrainians, cautious optimism, and questions too about how long the Russians can sustain this, because while they have not had to do a second draft, we are also not seeing troop rotation at the front, which is very bad for morale and readiness if you're just keeping your troops there on the front lines, getting constantly pounded and not rotating them back to the rear for rest, welfare, and recuperation.
Greg Valliere this morning says that the message in Russia to all Russian senior leadership, particularly military, is if you disagree with Putin, you're dead. If you disagree, if you confront Putin, you're dead. And so there can be no open discussion or debate, and therefore they've got to get to him, and therefore there's going to be some sort of...
So arguably this is where an authoritarian system could become more unstable, because now your only choice is to coup the guy or go along. So
do you agree with that? You agree with that?
I do. I think because he's either consolidated. So now it's shown that if you do go after Putin, you really have to go after him fully. And I think it's not going to be overthrown from his inner circle, because again, he's backed the very defense minister and all these, we're really getting into the Kremlinology here, but he's backed the group that's in the defense establishment. He's back in charge. And look, you even saw it. This went on. This is quite a juxtaposition. You have that BRICS summit, which we'll get into more. Putin couldn't come because this is an irony. He's too big of a war criminal to go to Africa. And then you have the fact that he...
Wait. I know. Okay, so I know by different courts he's been declared a war criminal. He couldn't go to Africa because...
He couldn't go to South Africa because they would have to arrest him for the International Criminal Court. That's why he attended ultimately via video. Again, when your war crimes rap sheet is too large to travel to Africa, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this. You've done something, really to piss off the international community, and not even South Africa could welcome him to the summit. So while he's blowing up, while Prigozhin is falling to the ground north of Moscow, the contrast is India landing its probe on the south pole of the moon, where no country has ever done that before. So if you just want to look at countries on different trajectories there within the BRICS, quite a juxtaposition.
And the week before, there was a crash on the moon, correct?
Yes, the Russian probe crashed into the moon.
Russian probe crashed into the moon a week before. Who's responsible for cleaning?
And may I add, the chief scientist of the space program there became unwell after this crash probe as well. Yeah, he did. He had a health issue as well. So look, was it another defenestration? We'll find out what the exact details of that.
I love that word, by the way, ladies and gentlemen.
It's a useful word.
It means you went out the window, is what defenestration means. You went out the window. Okay.
Look, this is you had this BRICS summit, and again, they're wanting to push their alternative to Western leadership. Now, mind you, they're pushing their alternative to Western leadership using a acronym derived by Goldman Sachs. So we're not exactly breaking free from the establishment there. But look, they want to incorporate Saudi Arabia and these other players. They want to create what is a global South system that isn't as reliant on the West or the dollar. But you have two of the big players there. Russia bogged down in Ukraine, Putin, as we described, and then China. Xi Jinping is there. He's there in person, but a lot of questions about what his economic strengths are back home, how long he can continue to move. And when you're talking about true contagion in the Chinese economy, words and analysis of the Chinese economy that reminds me of how we were talking about our economy in 2008. And questions about firms that have been compared, Zhongren and others, like the Chinese BlackRock or Blackstone, as they've been known, now teetering in concern. All of this suggests that perhaps that anti-West model, and even though perhaps our debate doesn't encourage anyone about the health of our system, look, the West model's not looking so bad right now.
Sister Irene Krauss, ladies and gentlemen, had it right all along. No margin, no mission. Hey, Xi Jinping, listen to Sister Irene. You don't have an economy. You're going to have such trouble, and you've made it for yourself. This is the bed you've made. Your economy stinks right now. You've got a whole bunch of young people who don't have jobs. You're losing economic influence, and all of a sudden, you're not having growth. See how much influence you have without economic growth.
And it comes down to, I was in a meeting yesterday, and we're discussing the new outbound investment review that the Biden administration is going to put into place. And I wouldn't even call it review. It's outbound investment reporting. It's going to be a long year process. It's not even really choking the Chinese economy like some of the hawks would say you need to. But the Chinese economy perhaps is doing that on its own. It's already discouraging.
On its own, you close Hong Kong, you get rid of Jack Ma, you get rid of your entrepreneurs, and you start focusing on your spiritual notions and political notions, and you give up on your economy. This is where you end up. You said the BRICS, and yes, the BRICS was a term formed by Goldman Sachs, and it's funny that they're using it politically, to cover a cohort of sort of emerging or struggling economies that maybe there were decent investment opportunities at one point or another. I've said for a long time that we should just not have presidential elections. We should outsource the executive branch to Goldman Sachs, because we end up getting the Treasury Secretary from Goldman Sachs. We get Fed people from Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs ends up running it anyway. Let's just hire them. Then we can fire them if we don't like them. We can have performance standards for Goldman Sachs. I think it works. So that's it. We're going to have a presidential debate last night. See that segue I made there? The presidential debate last night for the Republican side, except, speaking of no oxygen in the room, Donald Trump wasn't there. They were talking about him. Who won that last night? I heard some said Nikki Haley was Valier's choice.
Look, I think Nikki Haley had probably the strongest performance, at least in consistency, as well as staying on message. I think for a lot of people, though, who are tired of politics as usual, Vivek Ramaswamy did an excellent job introducing himself and really parrying the traditional politicians there on stage. I think it was a very disappointing night for DeSantis, who needed to really break out if there was going to be a moment to re-energize his campaign. I think a lot of people saw he almost looked robotic at times on the stage, so it did not help with that criticism of him.
I thought he was nearly lifelike. I really did.
Nearly. DeSantis 3.4
DeSantis was nearly lifelike last night, which was a step up from last time I saw him.
Yeah, so you can't recover your poll numbers if you're sitting there in the uncanny valley. So what he would need to do is make this more and more a race of him versus Trump. That's the only way DeSantis would be able to win this. And he's, one, not willing to do that. And two, until he does, there's not going to be any traction. And I don't see any of them getting any traction against Trump last night.
One of the things I love watching in some of these videos, YouTube things on the internet, are the beginnings of so many Ronald Reagan speeches where he would tell a joke. And he did that all the time. And the thing that strikes you when Reagan was at the microphone was his gravitas. The gravitas of Reagan, when he controlled the room and he'd look up and he'd pause, and you'd know if Reagan wasn't going to go there, nobody was going to go there. I didn't see that last night. And when I looked at Ramaswamy, I saw everything but that. I saw a very energetic young man, very bright young man. He's willing to throw it up and toss it out there with all the other not really. I didn't see anything presidential. Mike Pence tried to look presidential. Chris Christie looked as petulant as ever, and a little bombastic, and he was good and entertaining. Some of them I can't even remember their names now, and I couldn't remember their names last night. But yeah, Nikki Haley kind of looked a little presidential. And
a strong night for the Asa Hutchinson fan club, there. But look, no, I think Vivek, again, he was trying to, and I think it would resonate with a lot of younger people, as many of them are still involved in Republican politics right now. It resonated, though, with a lot of people.
There are about 6 younger people still involved in
Republican with politics, the way politics are as usual. And the way that they see a lot of, and, particularly on a night when Donald Trump's not on the stage and he has the opportunity to be the non-conventional politician. He tried to do, I think, a younger Trump playbook in some ways, and we'll see how the poll numbers in public respond to that. But I think if you look at the heart of the Republican electorate, which is a lot more looking like Trump and Vivek rather than Asa and Chris Christie.
What do you think happens over the next week? What are you watching? We're over time already. I've got to get to Jeff Lacker. What do you look next week? What are you looking at, Dan?
I'm still keeping an eye on what we're doing on these spending deadlines coming up September 30th, because once we get back, there's so little time to actually get anything done. What's being done in terms of posturing, and also what we're seeing we had a group of bipartisan senators just go to Ukraine. Blumenthal, Graham, and Elizabeth Warren, the bipartisan group going to Kyiv, keeping an eye on what they're saying, because this big $1 billion package for Ukraine going to be the big fault line between not just the parties, but the Senate and the House.
We're going to talk about that next week, Dan. We're going to see if we've got this shutdown coming up. Jeff Lacker, former president of the Richmond Federal Reserve Bank, professor at a lot of different places, really smart, thoughtful guy, hawkish, thinks that the Fed needs to keep raising rates. We're going to talk to Jeff when we come right back. And here's just a quick teaser for next week, Dan, just to get you thinking. Starbucks is already starting to hawk its new pumpkin spice latte, but they're going to have a new one this year, iced pumpkin cream chai latte with the pumpkin cream cold brew. It's August, folks. Leave me alone, Starbucks. We're not there yet. We will be back with Jeff Lacker. Dan Mahaffee, thank you. We'll be right back. Please stay with us on the FarrCast.
Michael Farr and the FarrCast are proud to support Heroes, Inc. Heroes supports the spouses and children of law enforcement officers and firefighters who gave their lives in the line of duty to the greater Washington, D.C. community. Their singular goal is to honor the supreme sacrifice made by these individuals by caring for their families. Heroes' work begins within 24 hours of the tragic loss and continues indefinitely. We invite you to learn more about Heroes' mission at heroes.org. We hope that you will consider supporting Heroes as they endeavor to honor those who protect us. That's heroes.org. Heroes, here for you, here for good. And now, back to the FarrCast and your host, Michael Farr. We appreciate you listening into the FarrCast this week. And now to introduce this week's special guest, here's your host, Michael Farr.
Welcome back to the FarrCast. Joining me now, what a great treat, Dr. Jeffrey Lacker, the past president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, Virginia, was a voting member of the Federal Open Market Committee, attended so many of those Jackson Hole economic summits, all of the Fed meetings, and has provided us great insight for years, ladies and gentlemen. One of the smartest guys I know. Most important, one of the nicest guys I know. Welcome back, Jeff.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be with you, Michael.
we're happy here. I wish you could have seen his face, ladies and gentlemen, when I said he was one of the nicest guys I know. Doesn't look like he agreed with me. Anyway, he had that look on his face like
sentiment.
you should meet more guys as far as stuff. I'm not, that was the look. Okay. So here we go. Jeff, I have this notion that one of two things has to be true. Either the Fed hasn't raised rates high enough to curtail inflation, or we haven't waited long enough to see the tail effects of the rates they've already have, to let this later impact come out and actually hit the economy. Which one of those is true?
So that's a really good question, Michael, the way you frame it. I don't think the second option has to do with this question of how much lags there are. What
Yes.
kind of policy effects are in the pipeline have yet to be revealed. And I'm in the camp that thinks that because the Fed telegraphed its moves so early, and moreover, that the need for the moves it made last year were apparent at the end of the year before. Because of that, markets have sort of built in those rate increases and the effect on the 2-year and the 5-year and everything yield way earlier than in typical tightening cycles. So I'm in the camp that thinks that there isn't much lag effect left to flow through to the economy. So then the question is, have they done enough? I think there's no question that the last 2 months of inflation reports, the ones for May and June,
Yes.
were very good, better than expected. And you look at the graphs in the newspaper, the headline 12-month rate, that's not the thing that was such a great news. I mean, that came down a lot. It's down to like 3% now on a 12-month basis. But the really good news was that the core indexes were up. If you look at the month-over-month change from April to May and then May to June, those were at a rate of around 2%, whereas they had been running between 4 and 5% for months on end. So 2 months ago, the inflation picture looked like, there's a bunch of stickiness you can see in the data. Now some of that stickiness kind of disappeared for 2 months. Now, whether it sticks around or not, whether core inflation stays low or not, that remains to be seen. And there's some headwinds there that could drive it up again. So I think the Fed has to be cautious. And, it looks like wage rates, for example, aren't running ahead at a rate that's consistent with 2% core inflation. So, we have to have some softening in wages. And, you get these big union things coming online. You don't know how that's going to play out. And, it could be a fluky month or two of data. You never know. That happens too. You get runs of a few months of better than expected data, and it's just fluky things that go away. So, and then you got energy prices coming back up again. So you got firming gasoline prices, and that'll push back against the dampening down, of course. So there's reasons to think they're not done yet for sure, getting inflation down to 2%. So they got to be cautious. Plus, growth is so strong now. On the real side, spending, consumer spending. I mean, we could get a 4% GDP number for the third quarter, or close to it. Well over 3% is what some forecasts are saying, and that makes it seem like rates need to be higher.
But inflation's not higher. If the inflation data continues to come down, if real rates remain positive and inflation data comes down, then the real rate actually increases when the Fed stays stable. Now,
that's right, Michael. Yeah, John Williams pointed that out. A bunch of people pointed that out, that the key thing for the effect of monetary policy on the economy is the real interest rate, the federal funds rate minus what people think the general run rate of inflation is. If inflation comes down without any change in the Fed funds rate, that makes policy tighter.
Yes.
Just like when inflation goes up and nobody changes the Fed funds rate, policy gets way looser than it was.
Yes.
So, that'll work in the Fed's favor. I'm inclined to think that, from what I've heard coming out of the committee, that they're going to stand pat for most of the rest of the year, unless the data breaks really bad really soon. They're going to wait and see how the rest of the year plays out before they move again. So
that's what Harker's told me. I gave a speech with Harker at University of Delaware in in February. And Pat used to be president of the University of Delaware. I mean, I've known Pat Harker for, hell, he was president when you were there speaking as Fed president at the University of Delaware, before he took over Charlie Plosser's seat. Charlie Plosser was there speaking with me at
events.
So I like Pat a lot. I find him a very thoughtful guy. I like him a lot. He said a lot longer, Michael, than anybody thinks. We're going to take him up and we're going to leave him there. Everybody thinks we're going to cut quickly. We're just going to leave him there. There's no reason to cut anything quickly, is what he told me. So, Jeff, is it possible that they just leave things alone for a while, and maybe in so doing they've engineered a soft landing for like the first time in history?
It's way more plausible now than it was 2 months ago before these recent inflation prints. So, and if you look at 94, 95, the Fed raised rates a lot.
What did you do with Jeff Lacker? I can't believe I'm hearing that out of you. That doesn't sound like you. I mean,
I gotta admit, I mean, I didn't think they could get away with it, but there's a chance they'll get away with it,
Well,
So-
I didn't. So much of the historical data still says we got to go into recession.
Yeah,
We
for
got to
sure.
go into the historical data says we got to go into recession, and yet it's not coming. Okay, great report. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of a shift. Dr. Jay Bryson, who's chief economist for Wells Fargo, used to work for the Fed, PhD guy, great friend of the FarrCast, really bright guy, wrote a 3-part series on the effects of AI. And one of the things that they conclude is that they expect to see a spike in productivity. And that this is going to be persistent productivity as a result of AI as we go forward. And that increase in productivity, when you think about GDP growth, is going to argue for higher rates much longer in that new, higher, faster growth economy. I mean, we haven't had real productivity growth for 15 years. And maybe I'm underestimating that number, but that one I feel pretty sure about. 15 years. So AI adds to productivity, keeps rates longer. What do you think about that?
I think it's plausible that an increase in growth attributable to productivity gains from AI or whatever it's attributable to would raise the real interest rate that the Fed needs to hold at to keep things steady and on course and inflation under control in the longer run. The cautionary note there is that it's, our experience with past IT related productivity surges is that they're kind of hard to see in the data, and it's because we got our data's systems are geared around old technologies, and so it's hard to get your head wrapped around it right away. There was this famous quote from Robert Solow, Nobel Prize winning economist from the mid 80s. And at the time, all of a sudden, everyone was using personal computers and firms were automating stuff. And there was all sorts of, IT and implementation going on. And he said, you can see the productivity gains everywhere, but in the data, and it was kind of true for a while. And then in the 90s, we did get those bumps. But then techniques for measuring that got revised later to take into account. So now we have an investment category for intellectual property. We didn't used to have that. So now intellectual property and software is its own investment category.
Yes.
So the other lesson from history is that these things tend to permeate slowly. It takes time for people to figure out just what clever stuff to do, what clever uses to make of new technology, like the internet, electricity, personal computers, and everything. It takes like years. And so it diffuses gradually, and it can make a difference over the course of a decade in productivity growth rates, but it's not going to show up it's not all going to show up in 2024, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So I'm really hopeful, but I think it's going to be a very gradual thing.
I have 2 final questions, believe it or not. I mean, I can't believe we're over time, but I've still got 2 questions. The first is, I'll give them both to you because I want to make sure we get to them. The first is, what do you expect the result of Jackson Hole, and what's Powell going to say? Where are we going to be next week post Jackson Hole? And number 2, as we look at the global economy, Jeff, we've got China's economy that here, 5 years ago was the growth engine of the world, is now contracting. Xi Jinping has put principle over profit economically, shut down Hong Kong. Who knows what he's going to do with Taiwan? Jack Ma is actually now an expat out of China anymore. So if you don't, as Sister Irene Krauss used to say, no margin, no mission. If you don't have a strong economy and you're on the wrong trajectory, what do you do with the Chinese economy? What's happening with the Russian European economy given the war? And if the global economy continues to be this weak, soft space, how long can the U.S. economy drag the whole thing forward?
Great questions. So on the second one, it's definitely a drag on growth. But on the other hand, the way the U.S. is playing, this industrial policy card is inducing a huge amount of investment in the United States. So while it has the downside of lowering global demand for goods and services, the strategic reaction of the U.S. and Europe is going to bolster investment domestically in those countries. They're going to try and be more self-contained. Now, they're not going to. It's not going to be as cost effective, but they're willing to invest and incur the costs to do that. So that'll be a damper on productivity growth, but it'll be a positive for demand. Now, what was the first?
Do you call
question?
that protectionism, or is it just?
Oh yeah.
It is protectionism. I mean, it's really a choice to say we're not going to deal with these. Okay.
Yeah.
And protectionism.
What's the first question? Oh, sorry.
I'm going back to Jackson Hole's the first question. But
Jackson Hole. Yeah. So I think I think he's going to sound a cautious note. I think he's going to push back on victory laps and victory dances. I think he's going to, highlight, there's kind of more to do. We're not there yet. So I think that's going to be kind of the message coming out. But there is going to be behind the scenes a lot of pats, people patting themselves on the back, at least Fed officials.
That's going to be our great title for the FarrCast, I think, this week. No victory lap yet. No victory lap yet, says Lacker. Perfect. Jeff, thank you so much for being with us. We always
my pleasure, Michael.
Always learn so much. Ladies and gentlemen, that's it for another FarrCast as we cover Wall Street, Washington, and the world. And boy, we did this week. I know it. And remember what Mahaffee says. We thank you for flying Prigozhin Airlines. We think that no more there. Sorry. That's it for another FarrCast. We'll talk to you next week covering Wall Street, Washington, the world. For Harry Jennings, our producer, everybody at Farr Miller in Washington, thanks so much for listening. Please share us on your social media. Far out. Talk to you next week.
That's a wrap on this episode of the FarrCast. Thanks for being with us, and thanks to our guests, Jim Lebenthal, Dan Mahaffee, and special guest, Dr. Jeffrey Lacker. The FarrCast comes to you weekly and is produced by Michael Farr and Harry Jennings and is available for free on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major podcast platforms. We love hearing from you every week. You can reach us at hjennings@farrmiller.com. Let us know any questions you have, topics you'd like to hear us cover. We would like to remind you that the FarrCast podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or financial advice. The information, statements, comments, views, and opinions expressed or provided in this podcast, including by speakers who are not officers, employees, or agents of Hightower Advisors or Farr Miller in Washington, are not necessarily those of Farr Miller in Washington, Hightower Advisors, or any firm any of our guests may represent. Any mention of a specific security should not be construed as a recommendation to buy or sell, and please be aware that past performance is not a guide to the future performance of any security, index fund, manager, or strategy. We strongly recommend you review with a financial professional before you make any investment decision. And if we can be of assistance at Farr Miller in Washington, please reach out to me at hjennings@farrmiller.com. We are here to help, and I'll be happy to put any of our listeners in touch with one of our investment professionals for a complimentary review of your portfolio and your investment goals. Take care, stay safe, and stay healthy. Join us next week as we continue to wind down Season 6. They'll be on the headlines each week with the FarrCast. Wall Street, Washington, and the world. Farr, Miller & Washington is a group comprised of investment professionals registered with Hightower Advisors, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Some investment professionals may also be registered with Hightower Securities, LLC, member FINRA and SIPC. Advisory services are offered through Hightower Advisors, LLC. Securities are offered through Hightower Securities, LLC. All information referenced herein is from sources believed to be reliable. Farr, Miller & Washington and Hightower Advisors, LLC have not independently verified the accuracy or completeness of the information contained in this podcast. Farr, Miller & Washington and Hightower Advisors, LLC and any of its affiliates make no representations or warranties, expressed or implied, as to the accuracy or completeness of the information or for statements or errors or omissions or results obtained from the use of this information. Farr, Miller & Washington and Hightower Advisors, LLC and any of its affiliates assume no liability for any action made or taken in reliance on or relating in any way to the information. This podcast and the materials contained herein were created for informational purposes only. The opinions expressed are solely those of the authors and do not represent those of Hightower Advisors, LLC or any of its affiliates. Farr, Miller & Washington and Hightower Advisors, LLC or any of its affiliates do not provide tax or legal advice. This material was not intended or written to be used or presented in any way to any entity as tax or legal advice. Clients are urged to consult their tax and or legal advisors for related questions.